Welcome back, everybody, at another episode. We got Mo on the line, and we're going to get into mental health. Mo, what's up?
What's going on? How are you?
Good. And just to clarify, mental health and law enforcement specifically, this is going to be, 3 or 4 episodes of this. We're trying not to make it back to back to bring it down, but it's something that's very important. And it's something that all cops talk about, whether in private or it's getting more pushed publicly, but I definitely think it's something that needs to be addressed, or at least talked about.
I fully agree. I feel like mental health in law enforcement has just now become something that has some credence to it. In the past, mental health was really pushed down and pushed back and frowned upon almost at times. And now we are seeing that it's okay to say that cops, not just people in the military, but cops, firefighters, all first responders experience PTSD in many cases. So I think it's definitely something that we need to talk about and need to touch on.
Absolutely. And again, this one's going to be focused mostly on law enforcement directly, but like you touched on, it impacts military, firefighters, all kinds of stuff. And I did see, and this is for another episode, but I saw, it's just funny how these things line up because we plan on talking about these things. And I had an article pop up saying that PTSD in law enforcement is about 10% higher, 10 to 15% higher than the average population. And again,
I can definitely see that.
Yeah, it's like something like, yeah, no shit. We all know that. But again, to see somebody outside of law enforcement actively talking about it is like, we're headed in the right direction.
Yeah, definitely.
Awesome. Well, let's get into it. Actually, Mo, I'll kick it to you. We'll just kind of flow because I like the outline. We're trying to keep it because there's so much to cover. We're trying to focus on certain aspects between you and I, and then like we'll be coming up professionals who deal with this. So we're trying to cover as many areas as we can.
Yeah, definitely. I will tell you, I just want to give a little background as to why this is important to me. It's one of these things that as a trainer who is watching individuals come into this career field and then move through it over the course of 20, 25, 30 years, depending on what agency they go through, I have seen people that I have trained struggle with things. I have had zone partners to struggle with things. I have seen cadets start struggling when they first take on the job. And I know I personally had things that when I first took on this job, I thought, I don't want to do this. So, and when I started back in the late 90s, early 2000s, this was not even discussed. You didn't sit with your FTO or your field training officer and say, well, that call was heavy. I don't know how I feel about it. We didn't talk about feelings when you were in the car. So
No.
For me, no, you weren't doing that. So for me, I have been able to see through my career and through the eyes of others that this is such a huge thing. And now, fast forward, we have the social media aspect of it. We have all these things, and you have the media that jumps on any story that includes law enforcement. And we're seeing what happens when mental health is pushed to the back burner and it goes unchecked, how it explodes on the back end with people who carry guns every day. And I don't know how all these years we did not put a priority on this. So it's just one of those things that I really have a passion for, coupled with this past year, I had the opportunity to join a group, a coalition that we're actually going to talk to one of the ladies that's in charge of running this. It's basically a crisis line for law enforcement officers. I've had the privilege of being part of the group that is essentially building this framework from the ground up and creating this crisis line that is statewide here in Florida for law enforcement officers. So I'm seeing from all angles, well, and I say, let me back up. It's not law enforcement officers. It's for first responders. But obviously my focus is law enforcement officers, but I'm being able to see this firsthand, the pros, the cons, what happens when we are being able to reach out and help these folks and what happens when we don't. So that's where this is something I'm super passionate about, and I'm excited that we're able to do this little mini series that we've come up with. So I think when you talk about mental health in law enforcement, the things we got to first look at is what causes it. What are the factors that we've kind of been overlooking for a number of years that impact the mental health of these law enforcement officers? The first and biggest thing that we can't even ignore is the experiences. You have people who, for all intents and purposes, we're just human. We're normal people. There's no training that I can give you that prepares you for seeing horrendous, awful things. And with this job, you do. You will go to the child in the bottom of the pool. You will go to the horrific car crash that the person is dead when you get there. You will go to the call where you're trying to do CPR and save someone and know that they don't make it. But you'll go to the call where, like, I was a negotiator for a very long time, and you'll be on the phone talking to somebody, negotiating with them, and they kill themselves. You are crazy to think for 1 second going and seeing and doing all these things doesn't impact you and doesn't change you to at some level as well, doesn't desensitize you to a certain level, doesn't get you to a point where it becomes hard not to see just the bleakness and the sadness that happens in the world, and it starts to black out and go over the happiness that we have that goes on in our lives at times. So the first and biggest factor I feel like when we're talking about mental health in law enforcement is what these people are seeing each and every day, day in and day out. And no, not to say that every single 12-hour shift you work, that this is what's going to happen. However, you will go to that call. You'll go to the call where the baby is at the bottom of the pool, and you have to jump in and you have to pull that child out, and you have to try to do CPR while people and families the family members are standing around you screaming for you to do something because that's their child. And you have to get up and say, there's nothing I can do, and walk away from that call. And then you're supposed to pick yourself up and walk into the house where somebody broke in to someone's car and because they left it unlocked and they stole 72 cents in change and they want to report.
Yes.
That is going to be difficult to bridge those kinds of gaps for anybody. But when you look at the cumulative effect over the number of years, so that's just one day that happens. Well, now let's fast forward. Maybe a month later, you get another call, or a month later, you get another call. A month later, you go to a homicide. A month later, you can talk to anybody who has done this job for any length of time, and they can probably rattle off a myriad of awful calls that they've been to. And what is very sad, if you ever pay attention, they can rattle it off with little to no emotion, because that is what we are trained to do. We try to shut it off, and we assume a lot of times as law enforcement officers that once we shut it off, that it's gone for good. But it's not. And it comes back, and at times it's going to come back with a vengeance.
Yeah, it's something actually I talked about in the last episode I did with my buddy Chris. And again, he's in the corporate world, nothing to do with law enforcement or the military or anything like that. But just he was listening to me talk, and he said, this is very reminiscent of compartmentalizing. And when he said that, it made me think. It's like you handle so much stuff that you almost become two different people. He's like,
yes,
and that registered with me. I was like, yeah, I became law enforcement Tyler, and then I became non-law enforcement Tyler. And the way I acted with my friends and family was very different in mindset than I would when I put on the uniform, got in the car, and had to go out. And I realized that I was actually struggling very hard to deal with all this. And so I created that personas, I guess, for myself in order to deal with it, because I didn't want it to keep bleeding into my children and my friends. So I just shut it all off. And that creates that isolation that we're going to get into, where now all of a sudden the only people you talk to about that stuff are other cops. And again, not all cops are the same, but most are just like, yeah, bro, suck it up. That's why you get paid every 2 weeks. Or, hey, bro, that's what you signed up for. What? You're not actually getting any release. You're just kind of getting told to stop being a bitch. Very few cops, and again, I expressed on that episode that I was lucky to find you and BJ, would be like, yeah, man, I'm dealing with the same shit, or hey, whatever. Be able to actually offer real help. And you start to separate basically who you are, and you can only do that for so long.
That's 100% true. And until you just said it, I had never really thought about that fact, but you're right. And I think I talked about this in a previous episode also, where I said when I put my uniform on, my mom would tell me when I put my uniform on or my vest that I've started being very different. And I believe that was just, as you said, that second personality coming through to being like, and it's to protect yourself. That's exactly what it is. It's a protection mechanism so that you can do what we're not supposed to do as human beings.
Correct. You're going up into people's lives. And I also explained that it's something that, again, I just have a lot of time to think now, but it's also like, think about your relationships. You're very intimate with your husband, your child, your mom, your dad, whatever, your siblings. outside of law enforcement, that's about as intimate as you get with anybody, even your best friend. Then you become
Right.
a cop, a street cop, a detective, whatever. Now you are dealing with people at their most intimate moments. You are inside their house. Sometimes they've just gone through a horrific tragedy, or they're having a psychotic break. They're naked. Something's wrong. They're doing something they otherwise never would do. And you're there for that, the stranger. And not only are you there for that, you have to handle it. I'm like,
Yeah.
it's a weird experience. It's a weird thing to deal with. I haven't fully thought that through all the way, but these are things that are like, I'm starting to think about as we talk to one another and I talk to other individuals. I'm like, it's the most unique profession, I think, on the planet.
It is. It definitely is. And I think you hit the nail on the head when you said too that very often as law enforcement officers, we do these things that are very intimate with another cop standing by our side. We walk out of that call, and if that cop is not somebody like me or you or BJ that we trust, we walk away from that. We never talk to them about it again. It just goes
True.
unspoken of unless it's brought up at roll call and we kind of laugh it off for all intents and purposes, and don't get me wrong, I think that laughter and humor is definitely a defense mechanism that is positive that law enforcement has come up with, but that's the only way we ever speak of it again. And that sometimes can be very difficult because when we do hit that point where it's like, ooh, that one hit me different. Now I don't have anybody to really turn to. The person that I was there with, I don't fully trust. And if you're somebody who hasn't sought out creating that circle of people that you can go to, what do you do with all that? You ball it up and you tuck it away and you start drinking to cover it up, or you start doing something else to cover it up so you don't have to deal with it. And the other thing I think is interesting is what is a catalyst or a trigger point for me may not be a trigger point for you. The experience that you encountered might have felt or looked different. And not being able to express that difference is a big deal. I say that because I remember that there was a call that I had at the very beginning of my career. And I think I talked about it in a previous episode, but it was one of those times where I was there with other officers. I don't know to this day if it affected them the same way, but for me, it hit me at a point, and it was such a big point that I almost considered not doing this job anymore. I almost quit because that's how hard it hit me at the time. And it was going back just to give you a quick overview, it was a call where a lady had gotten hit by a car. She was pushing her child that was like 6 or 7 weeks old, and she shoved her baby out of the way at the last minute, took the brunt of the hit, and died. And what was the real catalyst for me on that call is I had to drive around the neighborhood clicking her garage door opener until one of the garages opened up so I could figure out where she lived. And I remember almost being in a fog when I walked in her house and looked at the walls where there were pictures of her and her brand new baby and her husband, and her house just looked like a home. And here I am, this strange person walking through her house. And when she left her house an hour earlier, she would have never in a million years wanted or thought of the police traipsing through her home because I needed to figure out who she was so I could call her next of kin. So that to me was such an awful call that it really took me to a place where I was like, I don't know if I want to do this job anymore. And then having to deliver the death notification to her husband, I was like, I don't want to ever have to say words to a person that make them feel like it made him feel when I told him that his wife was gone. So
Yeah.
it's the dealing with the horrendous calls, and it's the isolation that is created from these horrendous calls for various reasons. Because like I said, I don't know to this day if anybody else on that call was affected by it like I was.
Yeah. And I just want to bring something to the forefront. We're talking about experiences. I just want, for people listening, the people who come into law enforcement, it's typically, a young person's game, men and women, whatever. They're young and they get into this. They're excited. They want to serve their community. They want to drive fast, wear a gun, put the uniform on, arrest bad guys. And so in my belief, and I do believe this, the majority of anyone and everyone who signs up to be law enforcement, they go into it like fully optimistic and positive. And those of us who were in law enforcement have seen that road deputy or that road trooper or officer who's been on 10, 15, 20 years. And I can imagine they are not the same person they were when they first signed up. And a lot of it is from dealing with this, but I think that's a good tie-in from, and it's something I have thought about, alienation from society with the media and public perception, because law enforcement's been around for a long time, but I remember speaking to some of the older supervisors that would talk about the communities. Like they would see you, they'd be like, "Hey, thank you for what you do." They would buy them lunch. I mean, not saying that you have to do that, but there was just a real positive view of law enforcement, and they made you feel like, all right, what I'm doing is worth it. And I'm hopefully maybe somebody that we have on who's a professional in this, not me. I wonder when the media and the public perception shifted, if that impacted the rise and all the things that we're going to get into with suicide and divorce and all this other stuff. Because for the longest time, it's like, all right, I'm doing this horrific thing. I'm seeing this horrific stuff, but the public appreciates me. My neighbors appreciate me. And then it switches and people fucking hate you and they hate that you're a cop. They go out of the way to find you. They want to try to hurt you. And so it's like, why the fuck am I doing this? Like they don't even appreciate what the hell I'm doing.
It's funny you bring that up because I can tell you we saw a significant drop in enrollment when it came to the academies during the uptick of COVID, during the uptick of the George Floyd riots and things of that nature, because I think that people did start questioning up until I think not just late. It was probably a rise that was coming, and that was just kind of like the catalyst. But this has always been looked as a noble profession, and people did this when they went in the military, and then after they got out of the military, they either became firefighters or police officers, and it was a good place to land. Well, it all of a sudden was not a good place to land, besides the fact that it was dangerous, besides the fact that you saw awful things. Now, people didn't even like you. So that became a huge thing, and the media contributed to that quite a bit because the media, their job is to get ratings. What gets ratings? Whatever is going to be buzz or hot topic for that particular time frame. And if it was hating on law enforcement and the law enforcement perspective, that's what they focused on. So the media really harped and leaned in on that. And then you had public perception that was skewed as a result of the way the media was leaning in on it. Absolutely. It puts you in a place where you feel like I am separate. I am different. I don't want people to know again. Like we wouldn't in the past, I think we were careful about who we told what we did solely because we didn't want to tell a quote unquote bad guy what it was that we did. Now it became, I don't want to tell people what I do because I don't want to deal with on my day off. Well, so what do you think of this? It's like, I just want to be able to breathe and be a human being. And it's one of like, I always told the cadets when I was in the class teaching, this is one of the few professions that when you go out into the public, you will be introduced by what you do. Hey, this is Mo. She's a cop. And then the whole room turns to you and goes, oh, you're a cop? How long? What'd you do? You know, what did you do when you were there? Did you ever kill anybody? Did you ever shoot anybody? I mean, this is what, and people think like, oh, this is what I live for is those questions. And it's like, no, I live to just be human. Let's talk about your banking job. That's what I do.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and I remember during that time because, I mean, BJ was dealing with it, you know, as a black man in law enforcement that grew up in Tampa. He got called traitor, Uncle Tom. I mean, I can't remember all the phraseologies, but these weren't not just citizenry. Some of his friends started questioning and like, oh, you're one of them. You're on their side. He's like, what the hell's going on? Like, I've been doing this for almost 15 years. And all of a sudden I'm a fucking piece of shit. And again, I mean, that's what I'm saying. The public perception and the way people treat you. It's like, you know, you called me, bro. Like what, you know, anyway, but I think that has a huge impact.
It does.
Again, we're kind of tying into things because again, with all that happening, ties into morale and how, like you said, recruiting has gone down. People who even apply have gone down. This job's hard enough without everybody just wanting to shit on you and hate you. Because again, law enforcement is an incredibly valuable profession if you want to have a stable society.
Right.
But you have in here policy changes that hinder camaraderie. Can you elaborate on that? I definitely agree.
Absolutely, I can. Because I think that ties right into the media, like you were saying.
Yeah.
Because of the advent of social media and the media and social media being essentially the same now, it's become such an influence of what is perceived that we are doing and less about what it is that we're actually doing, that agencies have created policies and changed things to ensure that things look a certain way, even if it doesn't necessarily work the best. When I first got into law enforcement, it was very common grant you, we had less calls for service, but it was very common that your lieutenant, when you worked midnights, they were the highest ranking officer usually that was there. And they would call the whole platoon and be like, hey guys, meet me over here on a Sunday evening when we had been running and gunning all weekend. They would be like, hey, bought everybody donuts. Whole platoon, everybody who's not on the call came over, got donuts, grabbed coffee. We talked, we laughed, we joked about what we had dealt with over the weekend. The lieutenant was in tune with if you were off a little bit. You know, I always say I worked for one of the greatest lieutenants when I first got hired on. Her name was Lieutenant C. Arnett. And her entire platoon, if you talk to any of them, they would tell you she could have led us into war and we would have followed her. But the reason was because she took care of us. She made sure that if we were a little bit off, she asked the questions. She interacted with us. We had these kind of times where we would meet together and she would buy coffee or buy, you know, donuts for everybody or bagels or whatever. And, you know, at the time we were allowed to still do certain things in uniform. So the guys would have cigars and it was kind of a time to decompress while we were still in uniform and be able to have those conversations. Now, instead of walking away from the call and with the person that I never see again, I could come up to that guy and be like, oh my gosh, man, that call that we had earlier this weekend, that was insane, right? And then we could have a conversation about it because there was time allotted for it. Now, fast forward, because we're very much worried about what is that going to look like if somebody drives by and sees all these cops gathered up together? And what happens if they get it on video? Or what happens if this in the media, that gets out to the media? That we have pushed aside the things that are necessary for our ladies and gentlemen that do this job to be able to do it with some effectiveness and truth, I will tell you. So now you touched on it last time, GPSing on cars. So if there's too many of you together in one spot, there's a big deal. You have to be moving. You can't be sitting at a certain location for too long. So there's all these different policies that are put in effect to make law enforcement appear more effective. And I don't think that it's necessarily working when you take this piece of the puzzle and overlay it, because that downtime, that time to decompress you couldn't even put a price on that.
I can tell you personal experience, personal story. We had initial lieutenant and sergeant. And again, we're all big boys here. Like there's no calls, but we're all working on paper. We're all typing our reports. Well, we would all either meet up at the district or we would go to, you know, one of the few restaurants that are open, take a back room, and there'd be, I don't know, 4 to 6 deputies, but we're all typing, we're eating, we're talking, we're helping each other out with our reports and statutes because there's a lot to learn. There's seniority, there's new guys, whatever. So that was our time. It would take about an hour, but you're typing up all your reports. We're actively working while eating, but also sharing. Then we had a shift change and we got new commanders. We just kept, because we didn't see what we were doing was wrong. And I remember we were doing the exact same thing. And I think it was at a Denny's. I'm trying to remember now because now it's just it's springing up the memory. And Our lieutenant walked in and was like, you, and you get out. Me, BJ, and there was one other guy who was a senior. I can't remember his name. He goes, and once they left, he goes, what are you doing? And I was like, what are you talking about? We're eating and we're all working, sir. Like, we're not just sitting here shooting the shit. Like, we all are working and, you know, we're monitoring. There's no calls for service. I was like, we've been doing this for like 2 years. And he goes, I never want to see more than 2 people at a place again. He goes, otherwise I'll write you up. He basically just crushed it right then and there. And never again did anybody ever do that again. And again, that's where it became very isolated. Now you were like, oh, I'm going to get punished if I link up with this guy to help him or if I have lunch with somebody other than my zone partner or whatever it is. And so personal experience, saw that happen. And it created a rift within the unit because we all were like, oh, well, now we can't hang out. So then we started just, as it happens, you fall away from those guys because, hey, you're in a different zone. I can't come help you.
Right. And that, on paper, I'm sure the policy looks great to say I don't want to have more than 2 officers at a location, but nobody looked at the impact that is not necessarily something that is tracked on a graph. When you track the fact of now your guys are experiencing more sick days, are they out more because of this is just they don't want to come to work? Because I can tell you, for me, a lot of days I came to work because I knew I was going to have fun with the people that I worked with, more so than anything. Or I didn't want to leave the guys or gals that I worked with out by themselves. So I would come to work for those people before I'd even come to work for just doing the job.
Yeah.
And you don't realize that by making those kind of policy changes, by doing those kinds of things that are impacting at that level and impacting overall their mental health, their happiness, their joy, their wellness, you're impacting the product of work that you're getting also.
Yeah. And I will say, because then I transferred from that, I went to work with the state police. And it was, just for everybody listening, I'm not saying, hey, we're just disregarding calls for service and we're just like, fuck it. We're just going to hang out because we want to shoot the shit and talk about our issues. That's not what's happening. This is, you've been working, you're typically actively working while you're also sharing and talking, but whatever. I went to the state police and it was a real slow Sunday or whatever. And the sergeant sent out a message to all the guys and said, hey, come to the barracks. We're all like, oh shit, we're going to have a meeting or something. So we all get in there. Same thing. He had coffee, he had some food. Football game was on. He goes, everybody have your radios on. Let's hang out. And we just shot the shit, talked. And again, I think that lasted maybe as usual, like an hour maybe. And then calls started happening, crashes, and we're going to them. But it's like, it was such a complete difference from how it was when I left HCSO that I was just like, oh, this is amazing. And again, it's solely driven by policies and then also whatever supervisor you get that's like, I don't like that.
Right.
I'm very fascinated to talk to your husband about this. Maybe why this is, how isolated do you feel when you become a supervisor? Because now you used to have a squad of guys that you were all buddies, but now you're the boss. So, same things we used to do back in the day. I can't do that with you anymore. And again, I don't know.
Right.
I was never a supervisor.
Yeah.
But I'm interested in that thought too.
That's a definitely. And I even understand to a level that as a supervisor, you are handed down information and you have to disseminate it. But I still think that there's a way that it can be done. And there's a way for you to kind of give a little pushback from who's handing it down to you and say, hey, listen, my guys work hard. So this is why I let them do that. Because look at our stats. Because and that's the big thing. If they're producing and like you said, framing it around the fact that we're not disregarding calls. This is where we worked Friday night nonstop. We took calls from the time we came on to the time we logged off. Saturday night, same thing. And Sunday happened to slow down just because people typically, that's how calls for service work, is on Sunday people tend to say, well, I got to go back to work now, so I don't want to get arrested. So you have that kind of a little bit of a reprieve. During that time that's a reprieve, now we're constantly like, well, now's your time to do, you need to go out and do self-initiated activity. Okay, I get some self-initiated activity, but also let's give them those little mini mental breaks in these 12-hour shifts, because if they've worked 2 back-to-back shifts and never had a moment to breathe where they can just exhale for a moment, we might need to clue in on that, because that's where we're losing, I think, the beginning of losing these people. And then when they start leading into what we're going to talk about next is what happens when the experiences, the alienation, the morale being low and all these things compile. Now they start leaning into other things, the substance abuse, the divorces, all these other things roll into it. And there's going to come a point where it's going to pop. Yeah.
Well, and I will say this again, no agency is perfect. Every agency across the United States, every region. So I can give examples from where I worked or people I know or worked with, but like I remember when I transitioned from Hillsborough to state police in Maine, Hillsborough, again, it's an average, not every day. I average 4 to 6 report calls a night. That's felonies, whatever's going on. Like it's so busy in a 12-hour shift. Then I get up to Maine, and also you got to have all those reports done by the end of your shift. They have to be done.
Yes.
Then I get to Maine and I get like 1 burglary every couple weeks, and I'm like, I'm sitting there, I'm typing. It's like past the time I'm supposed to get off. The sergeant comes in, he goes, "What are you doing, man?" I was like, "I'm trying to get this report done." He's like, "Relax, man. It's all good. Go home, sleep, spend some time with your family. You can work on it when you come back. Like, easy. It's okay." The pace was a lot different, and I was like, so taken aback. But again, they could do that because they didn't have 15 burglaries in one night. You know what I mean? So there are differences when I make these comparisons, but overall, I think that the point is being made.
Yeah. And being aware of the differences are important, but you have to take a look at what you have in front of you and figure out what is the best way that we can support the community by dealing with the calls for services while supporting the officers so that I can have effective law enforcement officers out there doing the job.
Yeah, absolutely. And that ties into the next steps and kind of what, again, I know everyone focuses on suicide rates, which are on the rise, and for the reasons we've already listed. But like you said, people ask me, well, how do people deal with that stuff? And I'm like, a lot of people drink a lot, or they fight with their spouses, or they shut down and don't talk to their kids, whatever it is. And again, a lot of that they keep to themselves. They don't want anybody to know. They don't want to tell everybody they're having problems at home. They don't want to tell everybody they're drinking half a bottle or a bottle a night. They don't want to say that. And if you're on the midnight shift, a bottle at 6 a.m. when you get off shift or whatever it is you're doing, because you have to always present yourself as being flawless and perfect because you're a cop. And so that keeps a lot of people from expressing that to even their coworkers, who would be the best ones to probably understand.
And to build off of that, I will tell you, like, substance abuse in law enforcement is astronomical. I don't know many cops that don't drink, but then there is a lot. And the thing is we are very accepting of it in the law enforcement, like to say, oh yeah, that person can drink people under the table, and they do it every weekend. That's a problem, and we don't really say like, hey, maybe somebody should have a conversation with this individual. It's just accepted, like, yeah, you do this job, so you drink, I drink so I can survive. And there's a lot of jokes made about the level of substance abuse that happens in law enforcement, but it's astronomical. And it's like you said, we will have officers that'll say, oh yeah, I get off and for me to be able to go to sleep, I'll drink like 6 or 8 beers. That's not normal, no matter what time of day you get off.
No,
to be able to go to sleep.
Yeah, and again, I'll speak from personal experience. I wasn't getting there to that level, but I was having a hard time with shift work because, again, I came from the banking world where I worked 9 to 5 and I would go home. Now I'm working 12-hour midnights, and in certain agencies like Hillsborough, you do 5 of those in a week, so that's 60 hours. And again, that doesn't count the time you had to get up or do something for your kids or court time. So sometimes it's you didn't sleep 18 hours that day, whatever it is. So my body was all out of whack. So I'm like, I got to figure this out. So I tried Ambien, not a good idea. And you start listening, like, dude, I'm struggling. I didn't sleep today. I'm dying. They're like, oh, bro, they start supplementing with other things. Let's just phrase it that way.
Right.
Or they'll drink, 10 energy drinks in one night. There's all these things that will seem like normal, I guess, or it seems normal to you while you're working, but it's like, bro, you just crushed a case of Red Bull in one night. Like, that is not, that's not good. You just drank 2 pots of coffee. That's not good. And no wonder you can't fucking sleep. You've had 18,000 milligrams of caffeine pumping through your body all night.
Right.
On top of a drug.
And so they counteract it.
Yeah.
They counteract it with alcohol. They counteract it with also people, this is little known, but drugs. Like you said, the Ambiens, when you're not sleeping and your body's not doing that, you're more prone to injury. So now you get injured, you go to the doctor, you get oxys, and you're like, hey, I sleep good when I'm on oxys. And now you have a cop that carries a gun that takes oxys to go to sleep or to relax themselves and adds the alcohol to it or something like that. So you have all these things that occur. I know this was some years ago. I had a corporal that was over us, and he got addicted to oxycodone. Yep. He got hurt. He started taking oxys through his doctor the way he was supposed to, but subsequently he got addicted and got into a situation where he was doing illegal traffic stops essentially to be able to obtain more drugs.
Yep.
That's a problem, obviously, when you have someone who has the amount of authority that we have, and now they're doing things to sustain a substance abuse habit. And the alcohol is the easiest and most accepted because it's not illegal. And so that's why cops, I feel like, do that more often, because it's okay for you to say that you drink. Nobody cares. Oh, yeah, I had some wine last night. Yeah, I had to drink a bottle. And people joke about it. They're like, man, that's crazy. And they move on. Or, yeah, I crushed like a half a bottle of whiskey last night just so I can get some rest. Man, that's a lot. And they move on. It's not like the person says, oh, yeah, I smoked a whole bag of weed. Then somebody's like, oh, you can't do that and be a cop. Well, you can't drink a bottle of whiskey and be a cop either. That's not good.
That's not good.
you have those, like you said, the substance abuse, the counteracting where you do one to balance out what you're doing with the other one. And it becomes very problematic and your body starts to simply physically not feel good. So when you're not feeling good and you're using substances, then it's going to lead to the next thing. You're having an impact on your family, your friends, things like that. Divorces in law enforcement, that's another thing. People, again, it's laughed about almost in law enforcement. Yeah, you're not a cop until you have, a divorce. And that's, again, it's not normal to have a 60 to 80% divorce rate in any profession. But there's a lot of factors to that. It's the going back to the experiences that we have, the alienation that we feel, and now you roll it into you're sitting with that zone partner for 10, 12, 15 hours, depending on how long or if your shift goes longer, those kind of things. And you're talking to them about things that might be wearing on you and blurring those boundary lines in many cases. So it leads to infidelity. It leads to you feeling like this person makes me feel different than the person that I'm married to. And again, that alienation, all of those parts start playing up, all those pieces starts playing a part, and divorce is through the roof because you're looking for that next best thing, that next high, that for all intents and purposes, we do this job and there's a lot of adrenaline. There's a lot of go, 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 and then we're down. And then we're go, 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 and then we're down. And we then start translating those feelings into other parts of our life, and it impacts us to include, we look at now, me and the spouse aren't getting along. Me and the kids are upset because I'm never at home because I don't want to deal with this individual. And it starts impacting them because not getting along with my spouse, I'm getting along better with the zone partner that I'm talking to and feeling closer to. And it ends up, you're not just divorcing that spouse, you're unraveling an entire family. Or the other converse side of that is you have a mom or dad that because I don't want to be at the house, I work all the time. When I'm not working regular shift, I'm signing up for off duty. So completely checked out of my family life. But my justification is I'm bringing money in the house. What's the big deal? How can you be mad at me?
Yeah, I pay all the bills.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, sorry, go ahead. I don't want to cut you off.
No, I was just saying like all of those things it becomes a huge snowball effect when we start with experiences, the alienation, the morale, and then it rolls into whether you have a substance abuse problem. If now are you having problems in your relationship or going through a divorce or are you separated? And it seems to me that this profession is very set up to allow cops to move in and out of relationships because of the fact that it's like, oh, I can work an off-duty job. I can go get a courtesy apartment so I don't have to worry about where I'm going to live or those kind of things. Like the average person, when they worry about unraveling their family, they have to think about those things. So in this profession, there's a lot of different avenues that cops look at as ways to bail out, to move on to that next thing. And it becomes one of those things that's like, oh, it's very heavy. And now you got these things going on at work. You got these things going on in your personal life. And now you probably start drinking even more than you were, either because you're drinking and partying because you're single, quote unquote now, or you're drinking and partying to numb all of this pain. And you're still trying to all the while seem like you're holding it together and present to the world, your family, your neighbors, your friends, as if you're perfect. Because as cops, we have to be, because we arrest people and we do these things. So therefore we complain about it, but we put ourselves on a pedestal too of this is where we have to be at all times.
Yeah. I'm going to kind of touch a couple things because that was excellent. That was excellent.
It was a lot.
It was a lot, but that it ties into what we've been talking about. But I would be remiss if I've known a few cops, they called them sleepy cocktails. They would get home and they said the best way they could sleep is they would take an oxy and 2 fingers of bourbon or scotch, and that's how they were going to sleep. I do not recommend that by any stretch of the imagination. No. But you think we've talked a lot about health and fitness, mental health, relationships, and all these other things. But again, you're a young man or woman. You come into this, you may be married, whatever. That's the life that you had before law enforcement. Then you start experiencing trauma. Then you start dealing with it by drinking. Then you compartmentalize your life and you're like, this is caught me. This is, normal me. Then you start to have conflict with your significant other, your kids, whatever, because they don't like what they're seeing. They don't like what you're doing. So then you find somebody else who loves cop you, because that's typically where you find them. And you're like, well, this person loves me. Well, no, they love this version of you. They don't know the other side. And then add on to that, they love the cop you, they love the drink you, they love the addict you, because sometimes a lot of the times they're doing those things with you. And
Right.
you're like, well, this person gets me. No, they understand that side of you. They don't know the other side. And that's the
Right.
struggle that I've seen it so many times. I mean, I've lived some of that, and
Yeah.
it starts to create that animosity. And again, there are definitely men and women who I've known in law enforcement who can balance it, and I still maintain relationships with them. I talk to them. I still to this day don't know how they have the willpower or fortitude to maintain, but they did. And
Yeah.
let me also just say this: religion, your faith, these are some other things, avenues that people can use to deal with that. But again, with the church attendance, faith, and all that stuff, that's dying in the U.S. Anyway. I'm hoping it takes back up. But there are positive ways to deal with it, but that's not what we're seeing. And the things that we're talking about with substance abuse and divorce rates and the addiction and all these other things, those are on the rise. It's not on decline. And so there's a lot of factors that come into play. And so as you were talking, I'm like jotting down notes. I'm like, yep, I remember this, or I've heard this, or whatever. And it's just this the way of thinking. And
Right.
again, let's to recap, because we'll touch on suicide for a minute. So imagine that you were so excited, you started your career, you had your own family, you got on this addiction or whatever it is. You weren't dealing with your experience as well. Now you're divorced, you're going through a divorce, your kids fucking hate you. It's starting to impact the way you work. So now work's starting to hate you, and you're all alone because you can't talk to anybody about it because you're isolated, because you have to be perfect. You're a cop. And
Right.
we'll talk about this a little bit later, and there's still as far as I know, a vast stigma for anyone who reaches out for therapy or, psychiatric help. And so now you're all alone. You've ruined the relationships that you've had. What do you do? Unfortunately, a lot of people take their life. And I've known people, not personally, but like in the agency, that have done that. I've seen it on the news. I've read it. I know people who have firsthand experiences about it. And you start to paint this picture, and it's just like, oh my God, why would that happen? And then you uncover their life, and you're like, wow, this dude was spiraling. Nobody knew. Nobody helped. Who was going to help him? You've created this environment where you can't talk to anybody.
Yeah.
You can't say anything. And again, I'm not putting it on the spouses, but like they don't know how to deal with that shit either.
No.
So, not to paint a bleak picture, but it can go fast. It can go down real quick.
Yeah. It's not to paint a bleak picture, but it's to paint a realistic picture of what can occur when things go unchecked. And that's what we're talking about when we're talking about this mental health part. Is these are all the things that have been going on in law enforcement for a very long time unchecked. We know that cops have experienced things that they shouldn't experience, and we just ignore it. We know that the media and the public perception and the morale at agencies has been down for a very long time, and we just keep pushing through. We know that divorce rates and substance abuse rates and things of that nature are on a huge, the numbers are incredibly high and very skewed when you talk about law enforcement, and we just look the other way. So it's not to paint a bleak picture. It's to paint that realistic view of what happens when these things, we just continue to look the other way and hope they fix themselves.
Correct. And I just want to, we threw out a number, and I want to address it. So I've done some research, and it varies depending on where you get the numbers from, but it's roughly 150 to 200 suicides a year. It's rising every year, depending on, again, location, whatever's going on, demographics, all those things. This is vastly underreported, and Mo, I'll give my explanation, you can give yours, but a lot of times they won't classify it as a suicide. They'll classify it as a discharge from their firearm, accidental discharge, something like that, or accidental overdose, or whatever it is. Unless there's like a note or some like call, like, hey, I'm going to kill myself, they won't do it. And it's a lot of times to protect the family, the image of the agency, which that's gross, but that is what happens. And so this number, even as it is still high, in my opinion, it's still vastly underreported and classified as a suicide.
Absolutely. And I think that in many cases, they do it, like you said, to protect the family. And I can understand that, but it's not good to skew those numbers for those reasons, because then it brings down the real importance of recognizing that this is happening so often that we can't keep looking the other way. Unless it's definitive, they will put it as undetermined. They will say it was an accidental shooting, things of that nature. And I think sometimes it comes from two, if the agency that is the agencies that are investigating, even though it may not be that person's agency, law enforcement is still a community. And we're always trying to figure out, and it's hard for us to swallow the pill that we have lost another person in our same line of work, another brother or sister that does what it is that we do, to suicide, because I think it puts it in our face then that we have to look at ourselves in the mirror, and it becomes very difficult at that point.
Yeah.
And to build off too, you said agencies, they will sometimes underreport it because they don't want that, attached to their agency. That goes along with, when we talk about just in general, agencies are always looking at overall the big picture and how things are going to impact them. Hence the policy changes that we were talking about earlier, going into what's put out with the media. When there's information put out to the media, whether we're talking about suicides or whether we're talking about something that as a officer you've done wrong, they're going to make sure that they're protecting themselves first and you second in many cases, because the agency as a whole has to survive.
Yeah, correct. And liability and all the other things that come with it, which, again, I'm not a supervisor. I've never led an agency, but I understand it. But, the supervisor would tell me, he's like, look, we care about you guys first, because if you guys start leaving, quitting, dying, who are we supervising? The agency is based off the backs of the people on the road and the front lines, not the bosses. And I think that is getting lost. Again, not all agencies. There are some really good ones out there, but again, we're talking more from like a holistic approach to what's going on. But it's hard to address because, like, what are you up against? It's tying into the agency, like the public attacks. Agencies then convert that and say, well, it's not our fault, and they start attacking the officers. And you start to so even though we've already outlined this scenario of isolation, you start to get pushback from your own zone partners who don't want to do anything with you because now you're tainted.
Right.
Yeah.
And when we're talking about the agency tax, I want to kind of break it down too, so people understand where we're coming from. There's public attacks on the agencies where we have people who seek you out. Like I think you were talking earlier, where it's different now, where people are looking to find us to do things so that we can look bad, or they can get us on video making a mistake. Human beings are doing this job. So we are not going to be perfect. There's going to be mistakes at times. There's going to be where you have people who simply interpret laws wrong in a situation of stress, or they maybe just didn't fully understand the law. Not to say that they should get a pass for it, but we have people seeking officers out to put them on YouTube, to create viral videos, to do whatever they can to make the officer look bad. And subsequently, when those attacks occur, the agency says, wait a minute, this isn't on us. This is on that individual. They made a mistake here. And instead of saying it's a mistake and we're going to better train them or whatever, they go, well, not our problem. That was theirs. And they ostracize the officer because they believe it's more beneficial for them. Because again, the agency has to be saved above all. And that creates, and it goes back to what we've been talking about, that alienation for officers. When you feel like I don't even have my law enforcement community, my law enforcement agency to fall back on, now I truly feel alone.
Yeah. Well, and I don't know if I've already told this story, but as far as the public seeking out, I was on one of those YouTube clips in Hillsborough, and the guy was recording, put it on YouTube, blasted it to the agency. I had to explain myself. It was all fine, but the clip that he had on YouTube was me driving fast, lights and sirens, trying to weave through traffic. And then shortly thereafter, I shut my lights off, I slowed down, and then I responded to the call. And again, all the commentary on the video was like, oh, look at this officer being a dick. He's just trying to cut through traffic. He's probably going to lunch or whatever it is. Well, I was actually on a call. The guy said, I need backup now. I have 2 at gunpoint and possibly a possible kidnapping. It was something like that. And I'm driving. As I'm driving to him, he goes, 1 detained, all good. Everybody can stand down. Well, I'm feeding off what I'm hearing, and so I shut it down.
Right.
And all reasonable. The agency actually was like, once you initiate your lights and siren, don't turn them off until you get to the call. So they still had to find a reason to ding me for that, even though I explained exactly why in the timeline why I did what I did. They're like, well, per
Right.
policy, this is what you should have done. It's like, bro, what are we talking about? And then on the flip side, agency attacks on officers, I also experienced that where I got a complaint on a call that I had excessive force, completely unfounded. Even the suspect I arrested was like, no, he was great. Deputy Martin was, very professional, and my family was going crazy. I'm so thankful he didn't hurt them. And he used language. He shouldn't have told my mom to back the fuck up, but he did. It was all unfounded. But because I cursed and I used profanity while families were trying to kick my head in and threaten to hurt me, they basically took me out of my zone, took me off my task force, kicked me to a zone and said, nobody help him. Nobody respond to him. You don't respond to any. And I sat there for a month, 12 hours a day by myself, and nobody wanted anything to do with me because now I was blacklisted.
Talk about a morale killer.
Yeah, exactly. They wonder why I left.
I will yeah, I'll tell you what's funny. One of the funniest things I ever heard of when in talking about an agency not, creating a space for their officers to really be happy in was an officer that had been doing the job for a very long time. And he said to me, this was not the attitude I came here with. This is the one they issued me. And I thought, oh, that's awful to think that,
Yeah.
It's really, but you take all these things, like I said, you put them together, the feeling like you're by yourself, feeling like your agency's not supporting you, getting pushback from the agencies, morale changes, alienation from society and the public attacking you, and then burned out from just the overall experience of just being a law enforcement officer to the point where it's affecting your personal life and whatever fallout that happens there. Then the question becomes, what happens when you get to that breaking point? Because I can tell you what all those pieces create is hopelessness. And when someone doesn't have hope, that becomes they're in a bad space. There's a TED talk that I use when I'm teaching as we talk about suicide in one of the blocks of instruction that I have. And it's an officer that patrolled the San Francisco Bridge. And he's talking about when he would patrol there, he had dealt with people who were contemplating suicide and, standing on the bridge, threatening to jump off and that kind of thing. And he said he was talking to a guy and he was, talking to him about why he should be here. And, you just hang in there and we can get you some help and all these things. And the guy tells him, he goes, let me ask you a question. You ever heard the story of Pandora's box? And he says, yeah, isn't that the story where Pandora gets a box? She's not supposed to open it and she opens it and she, lets out all these awful things out of the box and, it goes out into the world. Yeah. And then he says, yeah. And then there was the other box where there was good stuff. And he goes, well, in the other box was hope essentially. And he said, the guy looked at him and said, what happens when you open the box and hope's not there?
Mm.
And he said, and then the guy jumped. And when you think about, you take all these pieces that we've been talking about, and like you said, you don't want to create a bleak picture, but the reality is when you have a puzzle that all these pieces start getting put together, that puzzle, when you get done putting together, is going to say hopeless. That's what it's going to say. And when someone is hopeless, then they're going to start making decisions based off of having no hope for anything being good and joyful and happy anymore. So at that breaking point, suicide, homicide, all those things become options, and they become ways out of the physical and emotional pain that come along with all of these things.
Yeah. No, and I definitely understand. And that's the thing. It's like when you talk to people who are not in law enforcement or don't read about these things or know somebody, the average person may have unless you're a victim, obviously, of some crime. The saddest thing that happened to them is they didn't get the job they wanted, or work didn't go well, or, they failed a test or something. And you compare that some of the horrific things that you and I have talked about in the past. And again, I'm still not there yet to talk about the super dark stuff. And I don't know that podcast is the best place to do it, but there's a lot of dark shit. And again, I'm not just saying, oh, woe is me, look at me. I'm one guy. This is all over the country, all over the world, and people deal with this shit, and they deal with it in varying degrees. But for the U.S., law enforcement is a profession. It's an important one, and people need to talk about this shit. I have not found any other avenue or podcast episode, whatever, where they actually talk about it like this. And so that's the purpose of why we're talking about it. And
absolutely, it is.
That's also not to say that being a cop, you do a lot of cool, great shit. And it is the funnest thing you'll ever do when you're driving fast, you pit somebody and you catch a fucking bad guy, armed robber, murderer, whatever the fuck it is. It's fucking great times. And some of the best friendships and relationships I've ever had come from that. So, it's just, you got to be able to find balance. And
that's the big thing. I didn't mean to cut you off. I was just saying that's the big thing is balance.
No, you're correct. And that was the final point.
And I think that finding that balance is what this conversation is about. It's like you have to, in order to find balance, you got to recognize first that this is an issue that you have to be prepared for and you have to insulate yourself for. Yeah. You have to create that resiliency in yourself to be able to address these issues as you see them coming. For a number of years, law enforcement did not look for these things. They didn't look for mental health issues when it came to cops and firefighters or any of those first responder type professions. They looked for people who were going to do the job, get the job done, go home, and not create waves as it's looked at in many cases. And instead of looking at, okay, these are things that they're going to encounter and how can we insulate these individuals? And that's where these conversations, having them and talking to people who are willing to listen to say, hey, if you're doing this profession, start taking care of yourself first and foremost. And it's little things. I can tell you the cop that I was in the very beginning was a different cop than I was at the very end. As a cop in the very beginning, I wanted to go to everything, see everything, do everything. By the end of my career, I remember there were many calls that if I wasn't needed there, I wasn't going to go see it.
Nope.
It wasn't necessary. I don't need to see it. I remember one, for instance, we were all patrolling together because I think me, you, and BJ were still assigned. And there was a horrific car accident up on 275 where a wrongly driver had hit some college kids and the car blew up in flames. 4 people burned up and dead in the car. And I got dispatched. So I was going to the call because I got dispatched there. And I remember I wasn't that far off. I was probably within 2 minutes of the wreck, and young Officer Monique would have still gone to that call and been like, oh, I want to see it.
Yeah.
The cop that I was probably 14, 15 years into my career at that point. They were like, yeah, you're not needed. I was like, clear me. And I turned around and went the other way because part of protecting my mental health at that point in my career, I had realized there's certain things you don't need to go to. There's certain calls you don't need to see unless you're required to be there. Let it go. And that allowed me, I feel like later on, because we were all together later on, and I got a chance to hear you and BJ talking about what you guys did see. I was able to then be a sounding board for you guys because I didn't get the emotional attachment that call brought with it.
Yeah. And you stick on a point, and I actually forgot about this, but for those listening in Tampa 275, it is a massive issue. So Mo's talking about one. I've personally responded to several of those, and one sticks out where I don't think they were college kids, but it was a car full of people. Wrong way they got on because it's the way the roads are. And the 2 cars collide and hit. And I was right there because I was pacing them on the right side of the road, we're trying to block road. It's a whole thing. And another car, boom, head on collision. Now, rational, anybody looking, they're like, everyone in there's dead. Well, I didn't think about that. I stop, I jump out of my car, and as I'm running to go try to start pulling people out, I feel it was actually a sergeant grabbed me by the collar and pulled me back. And I'm a big dude, but anyway, he pulled me back. And right when he did that, the car's engulfed in flames. And I mean, again, they were already dead, but like I sat there and watched that happen. And he was like, you don't need to go to that. They're already dead. But it took a minute because like my mindset was to just go. I need to get these people out of there. And instead we sat there and watched them burn until the fire department showed up and put the fire out. But and again, that's not the first time, and it wasn't the last time I've seen something like that happen. And I'm thinking about what you just said is like, man, the less of those that I had to, if I could have seen less of those, I would be just fine. One is more than enough.
Right.
And I wish I wouldn't have seen that one, to be honest with
Right.
you. So those are things that stick with you when you're sleeping or your quiet time.
Yeah.
To yourself, it'll just pop up and you're like, oh my God. And sometimes it'll wreck your day.
Yeah. That's what these conversations are about. It's not to create this bleak picture. It's to talk to you about how can you insulate yourself in those situations. And before it gets to what we're talking about now, that breaking point, that suicide, that homicide. And like I said, you can look anywhere, but speaking about right here where we're at, there's numerous suicide cases that we've had here in this area, numerous homicide cases that have all been law enforcement officers that have hit that breaking point. I can tell you one distinctly that stands out to me. There was an awful one where we had a deputy who he killed his wife, he killed his daughter, and he killed his granddaughter and then killed himself. That is someone who clearly had to be at a breaking point because no person in their right mind does that. And he was, at the time, he was a school security deputy and gets on the radio and says before he kills himself what he did and the fact that he's not going to be talked out of his next decision that he's going to make, which was to kill himself. And everybody that you spoke with would tell you that guy, I would have never expected it. I would have never expected about that guy. But there came a point clearly that he was broken. He felt hopeless and he didn't feel like there was anywhere else to turn. So when we talk about creating someplace to insulate, we've got to create spaces where cops, first responders feel like that they can go get help without stigma, without having a dark cloud to follow them, so that they can just go get help like a normal person so they don't break like that. Because that's the reality of when it happens with law enforcement officers, it's usually bad.
Yeah. And I want to get into the stigma stuff.
Yes.
But I just want to throw this out there because all the stuff that you're talking about, it applies to federal agencies as well. And
right.
I think I probably told you this, but when I was with the Secret Service, before going to the detail, is probably the best time I've had in a very long time because I was in a field office. Then you get to the detail
right.
and you realize very quickly it is the most isolated I've ever felt in my entire life. And this is why. You go to work, you're with the same people because you're on the same group. You're at the same place.
Right.
You are in a fishbowl because you're the power of the United States, and all eyes are on you. You're working 12 hours a day, depending on whatever. And then there is no, hey, bro, you want to go grab a drink or grab dinner after work? Nobody does that because it's in D.C. You got an hour and a half, 2 hour ride ahead of you sometimes, depending on where you live, and you go home. And you don't want to go out. You don't want to hang out. So you realize very quickly the only human interaction I would get would be going to work with the same people every day. Hopefully you like them. Sometimes you don't. And then you go home and you're by yourself. It got pretty lonely pretty quick. And I was like, woof, this is not good. And so I started actively having to seek out friends, almost 40 years old. I'm like, I need to make a friend. And but it's a weird thought, but I'm like, this is not good for me.
Right.
But yeah, it definitely ties in. And so anyway, I just wanted to throw that out there, but
that goes right along though.
Yeah.
That goes along with what we're saying though about creating a space where you can insulate yourself and recognize when it's time for you to do something like that. That's part of resilience, to know that I'm not in a good place, but what is now, if you're not in a good place, what is fixing it? You were able to identify, I got to find a friend. I got to phone a friend.
I got to do something.
But many people that get in those situations, they don't. They just get there and then they feel helpless, hopeless, lost, all these feelings that are just negative emotion on top of negative emotion on top of negative emotion. And then it's where I don't want to feel this anymore.
Yeah. And again, we're talking about things like I've processed a lot of this stuff, but when you're in it, it doesn't feel that way. You just feel like you're alone. Nobody understands. Your family doesn't get it. They don't care about you. And it's really no, people just don't know how to talk to you because you're hot and cold. It's almost like you feel like you're bipolar because it's like, no, I had a bad day today at work. It has nothing to do with you. Yeah, well, you seem real angry.
Right. Well, let me tell you what I went through.
Yeah. Well, let me
tell you what I saw.
Yeah. I definitely, before we get out, I want to go ahead. I'll finish that, but I want to get into the stigma because I think that's huge.
Yes, I think the stigma is huge. I just wanted to say, we're just two people. We're not psychologists. We're not mental health professionals or anything like that. We are two people though who've experienced things, and I can tell you that I always say if you don't think that law enforcement will change you, you're crazy. Some of it's for the good, some of it's not for the good, and you have to be able to recognize that you're taking all of that with you when you leave this profession. It's going to follow you. It doesn't go away. It changes who you are as a person. What I will tell you is though, I can give you some numbers and statistics that back up what we're saying, that this isn't just, okay, we're just talking. There's a website that I have looked at. Blue Help is one of the ones that I like because it gives you up to date numbers, and it will tell you how many suicide by gender. It breaks it all down. But just to give you some quick numbers before we talk about the stigma part of it, since 2020, in 2020, there were 134, suicides. In 2021, it went to 149. In 2022, 175. 2023, we got a little bit of a reprieve and it came down to 123 suicides. 2024, we closed out with only 103, which is a pretty good drop. And in 2025, we are 20 days into it and we've already had 6 suicides this year of law enforcement professionals. So, and this is strictly like, if you look on this website, it breaks it down where you can see all of the first responders or just specifically by profession. This is specifically only law enforcement officers. So even though we're not professionals, we're not, what we're saying is our own personal experience, but clearly these experiences are transpiring across all states, all types of law enforcement, whether it's counties, cities, small, big, medium, all of those things.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And again, I'm a big advocate of the more you know, you can start to address it, or, hey, I didn't think about it that way, or, yeah, that's what I'm dealing with now. So again, my perspective and my point, my passion comes from the sense that not that I'm going to save law enforcement. It's not something I could do, but we need to do a better job nationally of taking care of the men and women who sign up and want to do the job. We got to figure it out. But and I think that ties into the stigma attached to mental health and the treatment that it follows. Because I've seen it with my own eyes. I never experienced it.
Right.
But it's something that I'm like, this is not right. But I'll let you take the lead on that, Mo.
I will tell you the stigma that comes along with seeking out mental health or telling someone that you're struggling with an issue. It can be far reaching. People will say a lot of times, oh, I don't want to say anything because they're going to take my gun away and put me, on a desk job and I'm not going to be able to do what it is that I love. That in many cases is just the start of it. A lot of times because of this job, because of what it is that we do, that person that does finally get to that place where they say, I need help. The way a lot of agencies have it set up is you have to go tell your supervisor. Your supervisor then has to tell their supervisor. Then they take your gun away. Then they do assign you to that desk job for however long. Then you have to be mentally cleared by the agency psychologist to make sure that you're okay to come back and you're competent to come back. But then there's the behind the scenes, the gray area that happens as well. Because even if Mo comes and says, hey, I'm struggling, I need some help. And they do all that stuff. They take my gun, they put me on the desk, I go and I get help and I get mentally cleared and I'm back at work and I'm feeling good 5 years down the road. And I say, you know what? There's a position that's up that I want to go ahead and put my name in the hat for. I'm interested in getting promoted, or I want to go to be this detective position. In many cases, these times where they're evaluating people, the fact that I asked for help comes up. Well, I don't know. Should we put her in charge of a squad of people now that, remember that time she said she couldn't handle the job? And it becomes something that now follows that person for the remainder of their career. As an agency, in order to destigmatize this, you've got to make it available and open and non-punitive for people when they say, I need help, because they have the courage to say something should not be held against that individual, should not hinder them from being able to attain a certain level. It should be looked at as a representation of what you want your officers doing, not something as, ooh, that person right there, we don't want to take a risk, quote unquote, on that person. Yeah. Instead of saying that person did what they were supposed to do, and now they're able to now mentor people that are going to come up after them on how to handle situations like this more appropriately.
Yeah. So kind of jumping around, but I had an old head when I was going through my own personal stuff, and I'm like, man, I need to talk to somebody. And he goes, well, be careful, because even if you don't tell them, if they take your insurance has to code it a certain way. That'll get back to the supervisors, and that scared the shit out of me. I was like, damn. And again, this was not suicidal ideations or anything like that, but I was like, man, I'm having a hard time. I need to talk to somebody about this because, I want a better relationship with my significant other and my children. And I'm feeling it different. And I didn't know how to articulate it. I didn't know all the tools available to me because they at the time weren't widely available. And when he said that, I was just like, oh, fuck it. I ain't going to say shit.
Right.
And, yeah. And so, there's another point in here. It's like, for people who've never had therapy or talked about it, I love the fact that BJ's like, dude, I've had the same therapist for 20 years. She knows all my shit and she calls me on it. It is a personal relationship, and it's just someone to talk to. To me, it's even better if they were not law enforcement, because they can kind of look at it and be like, wow, that's crazy. They can kind of validate some of your feelings and your thoughts about things. But very few people are like that. And again, BJ's a big, confident dude, very intelligent, and so he doesn't give a fuck what anybody thinks about him. And I love that mentality. But a lot of people, it's like, not to make a comparison, but just to give an example, like people who've never had a massage, like, well, I don't want anyone touching my feet or my body or whatever. But then when you get one, you're like, yo, that felt good as shit.
Right.
It's like,
that's a great comparison.
I think, again, in football, we would get massages, especially on the legs and the bigger muscle groups. Like every football player wanted to get it. And so for me, it was like, what are you talking about? Massages are the best thing. They're like, bro, that's weird. That's uncomfortable. I would never let anybody touch me. I'm like, bro, you're missing out. You are crazy.
Right.
It's
I will tell
similar.
you though, it's very similar, but to go along with what you're saying that coincides with the stigma is, what clinician can I talk to about what it is that I do? So often as cops, we don't trust people with all of our baggage because it's pretty awful, to unload all the stuff that we have seen, we have thought, we have done, we have said, whether right, wrong, or indifferent, personal life, professional life, all those things, to unload, come into, a room with someone you don't know, dragging all that baggage behind you and being like, well, let's unpack this. They're quite often, law enforcement officers don't trust people with their secrets, is what it boils down to. So this is where I think it's talking to the community of clinicians that are out there. It is important that if you are open to having clients that have a law enforcement or first responder background, make sure you're doing the due diligence and the extra training that is required to be an effective clinician for these people, because it isn't like when you're counseling or you're being a therapist for the average person that does a banking job. And it's not to knock banking jobs, but they're very different. So the officer can feel comfortable. Quite often, officers, military people, they want to go to people who have a background in what it is that they've done. And it's not often that you see cops cross over and become psychologists or psychiatrists. So that's another big factor of stigma, is who am I going to go talk to about this nonsense? Who am I going to go talk to that's going to understand what is that I've been through if you haven't done what I've done? How are you going to tell me what I've thought is wrong if you've never done this job? And that's where we need to find there needs to be a community of people that can come together, because we need clinicians. They're not always going to be cops. They're not always going to have that background, but we need them to make sure that they are well versed enough with either going and doing ride-alongs or partnering with the law enforcement community in some way, shape, or form, so that they can have more of a groundwork to be able to relate to that individual that's walking through that door with all that baggage.
Well, do you have insight, Mo, since you're working with a group on how to either guarantee or do your best to guarantee privacy for somebody who is seeking mental health? Like, how does that? What avenue is that? Because again, I'm giving you what the old head told me, and again, I bet that dude don't know shit. He's just in his head. That's why he didn't get help. But
yeah,
can you speak on that?
Sure, and I will tell you, that's still a lot of urban myth that gets passed around with law enforcement officers. Oh, be careful, that can come back to get you. And I'm not saying that it could not. But what I can tell you is, like, for instance, the line that we're working on, which is the Hope line for law enforcement officers, that is a completely private line. They direct you to individuals that are outside of your law enforcement community to be able to get help. When you call in to that 211 line, everybody that you speak to, let me rephrase that, not everyone you speak to, but once you have called in and you have identified the fact that you are a law enforcement officer, they try their best to direct you to an actual counselor on the phone who has a law enforcement or first responder background. If they're not available, you will speak with someone because they don't want you to be in a critical situation and not get help, but they will create a follow-up so that there will be someone that has that first responder background that will call you back and will direct you with what type of resources that they can provide you with at that particular point in time. So there is definitely some growth when it comes to the law enforcement world. A lot of agencies are trying to be more proactive about addressing it and having psychologists on staff and having ways of creating avenues for officers to be able to report that they're struggling and it not be something that can follow them through their agency. One of the people that we're trying to line up later on, that's exactly what I want to have this individual come and talk about, is how their agency has structured their peer support teams. So there is a big swing for us to be better than we were in the past. There is just still a lot of growth because I think there is such a ramp up of struggles when it comes to mental health and when it comes to cops struggling with mental health. So we're so behind the eight ball that even though we're catching up, it's at such a rate that it's just, we still feel like they're pulling away, if that makes sense.
Yeah. And you're touching on something and maybe help me articulate this well because I want to make sure I'm clear. I'm a huge advocate that mental health therapy, therapists, psychiatrists, whatever it might be, that needs to be like going to the gym. That means it needs to be part of your routine, your weekly, monthly routine, whatever it is that you need. A lot of times people will wait till they are, gun in hand, like this is it. Maybe I should try. That's a hard place to be in, and there's no guarantee somebody can help you through that because you've gotten to a critical stage. Still seek help. I'm not saying don't. I'm saying you absolutely should before you want to start harming yourself or others. But my point and what I'm very passionate about is this just needs to be routine. And I've actually talked to a few agency heads about this whenever it came up. It's not like, I'm out there beating the drum, but I'm like, I've floated ideas like, a monthly session with psychiatrist or a therapist should just be, Tuesday is, go see your therapist. Like, it just needs to be what is done to maintain before it becomes a problem. Hey, this is what I'm going through. These are the calls I had. This is what I'm going through. This is my family life, whatever it is. Try, do the best you can not to wait till the very last minute. And I'm actually, maybe the next couple of people we have on episodes will be able to articulate that better. But the best way I could phrase it, it needs to just be part of your routine, like getting up, brushing your teeth, going to the gym, whatever it is. It needs to be part of what you're doing for your own personal health.
I fully agree. And I will tell you that is the start of taking the stigma away and destigmatizing mental health is by making it part of the routine. When we become a law enforcement officer, every single year we have to go to in-service and we have to shoot, we have to do, deploy our taser, we have to drive. Why on earth does not Florida Department of Law Enforcement have a requirement that you have to attend a course when you're in the academy that talks about mental health and how to identify and insulate yourself for these things that you're going to see and for the things that you're going to encounter, and then build off of that for the officers that are now working for agencies? Why don't they have to submit a mental health, something where they've seen someone, a mental health psychologist, a clinician, or a therapist of some kind? They have to do it, even if it's I think it's not enough, but let's start out with every 6 months that you have to turn something in to say that, yes, I've done my mental health wellness check for this particular 6-month time frame, and have that be part of what is required to be a law enforcement officer so that we can ensure that these people at that point, if it's just routine and I'm just going to shoot just like I would, or going to see my therapist just like I would go and shoot, it becomes not a big deal if I say to my therapist, last time we were here that we talked and everything was good, but then this is what happened. And I've been kind of struggling with sleeping since then. So I've been doing this to combat sleeping and this, that, and the other. Now you have a professional that can say, whoa, hey, that's not good. I know you've been laughing this off and kind of joking it off with your buddies, but that's not good. And I think we need to have some follow-ups. From that, though, if there's a follow-up created, it should not be something that routes back to your agency. It should be billed out as a number to the insurance company so they don't even know who it is. It's just being billed under this coded number for that individual. And it's taken care of that way. That is how you can take the stigma away. It's like you said, making it like brushing your teeth. Nobody wakes up in the morning and is like, I don't want anybody to know I'm brushing my teeth. No, because it's normal. That is how we can start making some normalcy about getting help and talking to people and recognizing the fact that, hey, I'm not doing so good.
Yeah, and you touched on it. You have shooting standards, you have driving standards, you have fitness standards. There's no such thing as a mental health standard. And again, I can already hear like the voices, of past buddies going up. You're going to start giving all the power to these therapists, and they'll say whether or not you could be a cop. And like you said, it shouldn't be like that. You need to address these things before it's like that. Hey, how's life going? Hey, everything's good. Agency's good. I'm progressing. Life is good. This is how I'm dealing with it. Whatever it is. But then it's 6 months later. Hey, I'm separated from my family. I didn't get the promotion. My boss is a fucking asshole, and now I'm isolated into this section. Okay, let's talk about that. How are we going to deal? I'm not saying give all the authority and power, but I mean, if you can't shoot, you shouldn't be a cop. If you can't uphold fitness standards, let me rephrase that. You shouldn't be on the street. If you can't, all these things. If your mental health is not there, listen, I get it. But if, hey, you're about to be a threat or a harm and you're going to do something really bad that you could either end up in prison for or worse, dead, you shouldn't be a cop either. Maybe take a time out or a hiatus or light duty or whatever it is. I mean, we take light duty for all kinds of weird things. Like there needs to be some sort of recognition of what you're going through and like, I need a time out from whatever it is. And again, I don't know I don't have all the answers. I'm not sitting here saying, hey, this is how we should do it. But these stats and this mentality is only going to get worse if we don't start doing something about it.
Right. I agree. And like I told you with the stats that I went over earlier, we're 20 days into 2025 and we've had 6 law enforcement officers to kill themselves already. 4 of them being male, 2 of them being female. It's a problem. It's a huge problem. And we're not, just to give you a little bit more statistical information, we're not talking these cops are brand new cops that are seeing stuff that they're like, oh my gosh, I'm so taken aback. I can't handle this. The average age of service for law enforcement professionals that kill themselves is 16.45 years. They're well into this job. They've been doing it for a while.
We would call them old heads.
They're old heads. And that means that they've had a cumulative effect of things that have built up and built up and built up and built up and built up. And they hit that wall of hopelessness, helplessness, loneliness, all those nesses. And now that's what happens when they hit that wall and then it breaks. So it's one of those things that like we have to figure out at least a plan as to how do we get to where we need to be at. Because right now what's been happening, and I get it, a lot of agencies will say, well, we've had employee assistance programs for years. People just got to take advantage of them. That is true that you've had them, but we all know how employee assistance plans have traditionally worked in the past. And as a result, too, like I said, there's a lot of urban myths passed around that, hey, don't use that because this is how it can backfire and those kind of things. We can just be a little more present and a little more proactive as agencies to try to make this just part of your duty assignment. This is just part of it. If you're going to be a cop, you got to be mentally checked out. And I can tell you as a cop, I did a mental health evaluation when I first got hired on with a psychologist. I did a secondary mental health evaluation when I decided to be a negotiator. We had to go through it all over again. But that was it. That was the only time I ever spoke with a professional. And I know if you get into a shooting or things like that, they'll make you go see them. But I would be remiss to say that I think that that's enough, because it's not. If we can create a space where it's just, again, a box that you're checking, so it becomes very routine, you get people used to something. And once they're used to it, then they're going to be more apt to be like, oh, this is one other thing. Let me just tell you this, because it's just normal. It's just part of what I do.
Yeah, and I mean, not to be too crass or anything, but it's like, hey, we have this program, and it's just what we do. It'd be like, hey, we have these condoms, and 10% of the time they work, but 9 out of 10 times, it might not. No one's going to use that shit, man. Like you're defeating the purpose. It clearly isn't working.
Right.
Fix your shit.
That's true. You got to fix it. And one of the things too you brought up, and I wanted to touch on that before we finished up, was when you said the point where you have the gun in hand and you're contemplating putting it to your head. Yes, call if that's where you're at. Call, ask for help, see if someone can talk to you, because I'm sure that there's somebody out there that would be willing to help you in that instance. But that is a very long way down the road. As a negotiator, I negotiated with a cop who was in that point. And the end result was I got him out, but what happened before we got him out is he shot at us.
Oh.
So very easily he could have killed somebody. We were lucky. He didn't hit anybody, but it's one of those things where, yeah, I got him out, but then he got arrested and charged with attempted homicide because he tried to kill, all of us that were in the SWAT truck,
Yeah.
So it's one of those things where call, absolutely, but we need to start trying to figure out how we can make people more resilient. No, we don't want to create this bleak picture, but this is the realities of what's going to come down the pipe if we keep looking the other way. And we have people that are continuing to experience all these things. And I will say this job is getting harder every year. It's getting harder and harder. So that level or these numbers are going to keep creeping up if we don't start addressing these issues.
Couldn't agree more. Mo, I love talking to you every time, and I'm looking forward to the next one. I appreciate you.
Awesome. Thank you.
All right. Thank you.